Henry Bruce Jones writes about music,
art, technology, and occasionally fashion. He is based in London.
Hello. I guess I actually wanted to start with a bit of a disclaimer, which is that I'm fairly new to the game. I think although I've been writing about sort of like art and technology for a while, I've only really been sort of really engaged with and like thinking through fashion for about 6 months. It's a relatively new role for me. So I feel like I've actually just come here today with like a bunch of questions, more than I have any answers at all. So I kind of figured I would kind of present all the stuff that I've been sort of thinking about and working through since I've started thinking about fashion, and I figured that maybe you guys would just know a bit better than me about how to make sense of it. So I guess the first thing would be to explain the title of the talk a little bit. Like what does it even mean? What do I mean by trying to get back to the body? It turns out it's like quite a difficult thing to define. Embodiment, I think the best I can come up with really is that it's just like a kind of feeling or a sensation that I've been chasing ever since I started writing about like art and culture. In the kind of people that I've been speaking to, the kinds of writers that I've been commissioning, and the kind of thought that I've been sort of drawn to within fashion over the last 6 months or so, it feels like a lot of the artists, designers, and thinkers I've spoken to are also kind of chasing this idea. It seems like everyone is trying to get back to the body. I think I can explain it a little bit because, well, from my experience, like I have a background in music. I used to write about music for Fact magazine, and for me, music is like kind of the medium that I think is like most effective at sort of a form of embodiment. When I first started writing about music, I was living in Berlin. I was writing about music I really cared about. I was experiencing it. I was going to parties. I was going to shows. For me, it was like a very embodied practice, writing about music. I then, at the beginning of the sort of pandemic, Fact magazine sort of expanded its like remit into also audiovisual art, which at the time was like a bit scary for me. It was like the beginning of the pandemic. I had no idea like really how to start thinking about or writing about AV art. But actually maybe it was kind of the perfect time, because I had a lot of time like in my bedroom to start thinking about it. And I think because I was coming from a specifically music background, and I was really experiencing, I guess, like the parties and the dance floors that I was spending all my time at, as this sort of like technology of togetherness, as Emma Warren says in her book Dance Your Way Home. I was drawn to very specific parts of AV art. And these were people who I think were really, I guess, like the music was really foregrounded, but they were also really engaging with what it means to kind of like physicality and viscerality in a certain sense, like what it means to feel, what it means to experience. One of these people, who I think does this extremely well, is Mark Leckey. And I spoke to Mark Leckey recently for an interview I'm doing for him for his show in Paris. And he was kind of telling me about like this mistrust that he has of images. I think he's always been anxious of the image. It's a big theme in his work. But he said to me, he says, like, he had this biblical mistrust about images. And he's talked about AI stuff as being sort of like, like diabolical and cursed. And I think I had the same reaction to this move from music to AV. I think the work that I could trust in felt like it was really grounded in the body. But a lot of it just felt like, like it was kind of blasphemous in a way, or that it was like kind of demonic. So I kind of then expected that maybe going back to, or like moving to fashion would like inevitably mean this kind of like movement back to the body. But it's been a bit more complicated than that, a little bit. I should also sort of say, kind of define a little bit more what I mean about CG AI, which is, as I understand it, sort of like kind of the industry term for how people are using computer-generated visuals and AI together in order to help sort of like fashion industrial processes. My kind of proviso for that is I had this conversation recently with Daniel Keller, who used to be one of the hosts of the New Models podcast, is that actually we don't really have an AI art yet. It doesn't really exist. We have like AI-enhanced imagery, and people are doing interesting things with AI, but like what AI art might be in the next like 5 years is very different to what we have now. So that's just kind of a proviso. People are still kind of figuring this stuff out. Which kind of brings me on to my next thing. So my two like methods of work at the moment, the stuff that I'm involved in. One of the things is called Squad, which is it's essentially like a future fashion platform. It's a bit trying to redefine like what a Web3 fashion marketplace can be. So it kind of it wants to sell NFTs, but it also wants to kind of redefine the kinds of things that it can sell and the way that in which people, kind of creators, fashion creators can sell their work. I write an edit for squad.zip alongside Gintal Yashinkaya, who I'm sure you're all familiar with. The other platform that I work for is called A New Plane, which is sort of they call themselves a creative technology studio, but it's sort of a kind of sister project or side project from Show Studio. So it's set up by Nick Knight and kind of his old retoucher, who's now a CGI artist called Tom Bondrag. I'm sort of, the fact that these are two relatively new roles for me, it feels like I'm kind of looking at this like impossibly Byzantine, like mess of kind of systems that is like fashion, digital fashion, the fashion industry from two sort of very different points, like from the place of the marketplace, which is like kind of at one end, and then also at the other end of the kind of the way the sausage is made. A New Plane does a lot of work with like commercial work, making CGI visuals for for commerce, but also editorial as well. So yeah, it's kind of an interesting, like weird dialectic, I guess. I'm trying to like understand it from both sides. And it's confusing, guys. Honestly, like I said, I've just got a lot of questions about it. What I haven't managed to find yet within the kind of work that I'm writing, although there's a few things that make me feel like that, is the kind of embodied feeling I had when I was writing about the music that I really cared about and I was going to the parties that I really loved. I haven't really found that yet within fashion. I'm sure I will. I hope I will. But I'm kind of looking for it. This is what I'm looking for. And this is what I'm looking to people to kind of help me with or to help me to understand. So what am I kind of asking? Am I asking how can CGI be like music? Maybe a little bit. My colleague, Rasheen, who works with me at A New Plane, just kind of was talking to me recently about, she has these like crazy fugue states using Sora, where she spends hours and hours sort of just like in this like crazy flow state of like generating stuff. And she said that actually like for her, the kind of experience of boundaries dissolving that happens to her on the dance floor kind of feels a bit analogous to the kind of the loss of her own individualism that she felt with this kind of giving herself up to that kind of collective intelligence that's inherent of the kind of AI training data within Sora. Kind of interesting. And yeah, that resonates with me somewhat, although I haven't really used it, so I don't really know. I guess what I'm really asking is, like, how can CGI be a technology for embodiment? Maybe that's the question that I'm kind of asking myself. I have like kind of a series of questions that I guess are the frame for this kind of conversation. I don't have answers to any of these. I wonder if you guys have answers to any of these. But this is kind of what I want to be thinking about as I'm talking. I can kind of read through some of them if that helps, but I'm going to return to them at the end. But I'm not going to answer them. I can't answer them. I kind of want you guys to help me answer them. How can CGI be a technology for embodiment? How can we use this technology to enhance our understanding of the neural media environment and the subjectivities it's producing? What even is digital fashion? Is fashion receding as the dominant form of cultural production? If world building is taking its place, as some people suggested, like what kinds of bodies will inhabit the worlds that are being built? And how is CGI defining the aesthetics of the body? I also kind of feel like I should apologize for this like very textual approach to this talk. I am a writer first and foremost. I think it's the thing that feels like closest to me. But it also feels like kind of a fitting kind of mode of inquiry. Like I don't think I'm offering answers. I am trying to ask questions primarily. The first thing I ever did at squad.zip is I was asked to write this glossary of fidgetality, which I guess in theory should be where all the answers to these questions lie. This idea of like something that is like crossing over the boundaries between the physical and the digital, it should kind of all be there. I was kind of having to define terms like AR, VR, what digital twins are, what the metaverse really is, what parareal means. But the thing I kind of came up against is, while I could have definitions for these things, like none of it really like hit. I kind of kept asking myself, like, are any of these things helping me get back to this idea of kind of embodiment that I was searching for? I guess the one that really kind of like stuck with me was AR and the idea of AR, this idea of like in the future we'll have this sort of, we'll all be kind of have this kind of like AR layer to the way that we observe the world, and the fact that like this could be sort of a site for embellishment or a site for kind of like style. Alex Peters talks about this in a recent thing for a recent piece for squad.zip. There are some people that she talks to that kind of feel really kind of like positive about this idea. Michaela John from Iduro and Black Girls Code asserts that it has the potential to allow them to be present, both physically and digitally, in a way that aligns with their cultural landscape like nothing else. And the digital artist Olga Itsupova suggests that it will be about creating a new way for people to look. Maybe someone wants to look like a fairy or a gnome. It'll be a more complicated experience for the users and much more interesting. I think that the future of AR is very fascinating and splendid. I'm very optimistic. I kind of don't buy it. I kind of don't buy this. I'm not sure. I don't know whether these things help us get back to the body. I don't know how much of this optimism about AI filters is just PR. I'm unsure about it. I really want someone to, like, yeah, to give me the sort of like case for it, or to show me the work, and maybe there's work downstairs I can go and see. I don't know. But yeah, I'm not sure. I don't know if I buy it. I thought then I'd kind of start furthest away now from the body in the work that I've been like kind of thinking about and writing about, and try and get closer and closer, like through these next examples. For me, the thing that I've written about and thought about that feels furthest away from the body is Roblox. I kind of spoke to Max Proctor, who's the kind of managing director of this company called The Gang, and The Gang make game modes with brands inside Roblox. So the piece was about how Roblox has become this like frontier for luxury fashion. I can throw up some crazy stats about Roblox. I don't know how much you guys know about it. But yeah, it's nuts. It turns out the metaverse like is actually here. It's just not very evenly distributed. If you're a young person, you're on Roblox. It's it's this like kind of like behemoth that is like almost impossible to understand how large it is. Recently in one of their fashion reports, they were saying that sort of like Gen Z people felt like styling their digital avatar was more important than styling themselves. And 1.6 billion digital fashion items were purchased on Roblox last year. So digital fashion is like kind of alive and well in Roblox. Although that it is this sort of new frontier for luxury fashion, what I learned from Max Proctor, who's worked with brands like Gucci and Givenchy and also Shein within Roblox, is that they tell brands to play by the rules of Roblox. So the aesthetic codes within the game are set by the players and game makers. And Nympha alumni, who I'm sure we're all like really familiar with, have a really good episode on how like horrible and depraved this can veer towards. Despite the fact that, luxury brands are taking it seriously, the aesthetic codes remain sort of like governed by the sort of like game mechanics and the kind of the ideas of the players and the users. When I asked him why Roblox is so relentlessly ugly, he couldn't really tell me. He kind of said that he thought maybe it was a rejection, that it was just like kind of kids defining their own visual language and rejecting older forms. I don't know if I buy this either. I kind of feel that there is something more primordial and base and disturbing at play here. Again, I would defer to the sort of like Nympha alumni episode about this, but I'm not sure that's what's happening. I kind of think that the ugliness is sort of baked into why Roblox is popular. I asked some questions at the end of this piece, again, none of which I think have really been answered. They weren't answered in my conversation with Max. I'm still kind of puzzling stuff through. Like, I don't know whether this was the metaverse we really warned about. Like, will we be voting in Roblox? Like, will we be forced inside these horrible Roblox bodies? There is a reality in which that's happening. I think I think it was the British government, or like maybe it was even Labour, like did a sort of Roblox collaboration where they're like telling people how to vote within Roblox. So like it's clearly on people's minds. But I guess the question that I kept trying to ask Max, I couldn't really ever get to, is like, is the process of playing Roblox, is that experience, ever an embodying one? And maybe someone in this room has had an embodying experience playing in Roblox. I'd love to hear about it. But it's unclear to me. It's unclear to me whether that's true. The girls from Ninfa alumni actually share my feelings about this. I spoke to them recently for a new plane. I should say actually that all the new plane editorial is not actually released yet, but it will be launching, I think, towards the end of February. So watch the space for a new plane. There lots of stuff is going to come out then. In my conversation with Ninfa alumni, they kind of had this sort of, they were collectively unconvinced, right? They kind of critiqued this overlap between fashion and gaming in quite a direct way. And they actually outlined this sort of separation between fashion people and then like art and tech people. And that there was this divide that actually wasn't being crossed. Biz Sherbert talked about it in terms of COVID and made the important point that kind of quote her, like, now that the economy is a lot worse, it's easier to see it through the depressing lens of people being too broke or disenfranchised to have an awesome outfit, so they're literally wearing digital threads. And I find this convincing. I kind of think that's what a lot of kind of Roblox and Fortnite's kind of skin culture feels like to me. She goes on to say, I think the dream of digital fashion was really being conjured and sold by art and technology people. Fashion people are really sensorial, driven by their whims and bodily impulses, like sight, texture, and seeing people in person. This doesn't appeal to people that are actually like stakeholders in fashion, even if it appeals to people elsewhere. So it seems clear to me that there is this undeniable attention. There's like a split within the camps, and it's also unclear to me whether there's any rationale to unite them. So some of the questions I have here is like, how can we unite the fashion, art, and tech people? What would be the end goal? Are those people in this room right now? What even is digital fashion anyway? Again, I come back down to it. Like, is it visuals for editorial? Is it 3D assets for gaming platforms and metaverses? Is it digital apparel? Like, what is it? How can we define it? And where does fashion even live in 2025? Like, where are the actual fashion people that are hiding from the art and tech people? I don't know where they are. I can ask my friends. So some of my friends work in like legacy fashion journalism and trend forecasting, and they would invariably say that like the fashion people are on the streets, the trends are on the streets. You're more likely to find to be able to understand like an emerging trend, like in a fashionable pub or a cool party or whatever is available on Depop or Vintage at any given moment. Because as Biz pointed out, like no one has any money, so that's where the trends are. I guess digital is much harder to locate beyond like the social media algorithm, which I guess part of what the summit is about is the fact that it's optimized itself out of usability for lots of cases. But from my experience, I know that both the Squad Marketplace and a New Plane are two places where digital fashion definitely exists. So, I'm working for them, I can vouch for it, I've seen it. And they would probably both answer yes to my question, that it's all of that, the digital fashion is all of this. But in both cases, both within setting up a marketplace and in reaching out to people for kind of creative technology services, we're still massively in a position of kind of convincing people within the fashion world like what the affordances of this technology is and why any of it matters. Most people are just kind of skeptical about it. Two people who surprisingly are kind of skeptical about it are Charlie Angman and Hilary Taymor of Coin Estrada. This is like kind of it's a brand that I feel like is fairly well known or well thought of for like using technology in really interesting ways. They have this stated aim for using the digital to kind of like reconnect with the physical, and they use AI patterns for their clothing. They made a kind of Gucci video game. They collabed with Freakatet, who is like a kind of creative technologist who's really kind of focused on a certain kind of like physicality and sort of kit bashing mentality. What's interesting though about the Gucci video game, which I know is actually kind of used in certain teaching contexts as an example of a brand using gaming technology, using CGI in a really effective way to communicate their brand and to communicate their sort of like goal, is that they're both very keen to, both Charlie and Hilary, to kind of situate it as specifically a response to the pandemic, and basically just that. They say that we made the video game Charlie said that we made it during the pandemic. It was a way to connect people when they couldn't be proximate, and that they're deeply invested in the physical and using digital aspects as a way to bring us back into a relationship with each other. They seem to have moved off quite quickly for understanding like the affordances of this technology as allowing people to be physically proximate as soon as that wasn't the only way that we could do it. Like they had a show recently, it was called Touch Grass. So I think they're kind of moving away from that stuff. And actually they're quite critical of kind of this overlap between fashion and gaming, which I kind of understand. Hilary Taymor is more critical than Charlie. But Charlie, I think, is the person who has this sort of like a kind of an overview of it. And he says, that I think people don't want to live in an atomized, fully digitalized world. They're not enthusiastically going towards the vision of a metaverse. That's not a thing that most people actually want for themselves. And his reason would be, I think, is because it's like disembodied. So no Roblox for Charlie. What's interesting about Charlie, though, is that I'd say that his imagery and his use of AI is, I think it's a very, very important example of an image-making practice that closely engages with the body and its drives, specifically using AI. And the way that he does this, as I understand it, is that it's to do with his engagement with desire. So he says, in the context of AI, I'm specifically drawn to misrepresentations of desire. What does it mean to try to depict something or to give us an imitation of an experience that is an embodied experience? Desire is a feeling that's very deeply rooted in the body. What does it mean then to flatten it and make it into a sort of digital or imagistic representation? I'm going to put a long quote up on the screen now, but I can sort of summarize it for you, which is that he's talking about the fact that it's the kind of this misinterpretation of desire by AI that allows him to sort of might allow us to understand the kind of the nature of desire like more fully. And I think in his images, in his use of AI, it identifies something kind of high dimensional about desire. And I think that might help us understand what neural media is doing to our bodies and the way that we perceive our bodies, as well as the nature of neural media itself. There's something in these images that makes they feel like music to me in lots of different ways. I feel embodied looking at them, and I feel parts of my own drive of desire being sort of challenged and pulled by the way that technology is being used in these images. He goes on to make kind of an important point about this kind of divide that NYNFA alumni sort of identified, which is that fashion sort of the fashion people or fashion itself as a kind of an industrial entity is really based around markets, and that stuff is always is going to be quite separate from emerging technologies, partially because it's to do with like a lack of control, but also I think there's a more sort of like ontological divide there. He says that fashion is a very bodily thing, it's about objects, and so AI is kind of against what fashion is sort of supposed to be doing. I think this is why fashion is really slow adopting it, because the primary function is actually the market. The markets are necessarily going to try to maximize some sort of understandable access to product and productivity and profitability, and as things become more and more dematerialized, I don't think fashion has figured it out. Sort of in like relation to that, or in discussion with that, had this, I kind of spoke to Kathy McGee of the kind of research platform Digitoile for a new plane. She's someone who's very engaged with the ways that bodies and industry and the market are intertwined, and she uses digital tools, CGI techniques, and AI in order to kind of achieve this. She set up Digitoile with the designer Per Gottson, and she specifically worked with a new plane on digital garment conservation for Sleeping Beauty's Reawakening Fashion, which was the Costume Institute's Spring 2024 exhibition at the Met Museum. She's also a senior lecturer on digital fashion at Central St. Martin's, and she teaches on the use of 3D scanning photogrammetry, Rhino 3D, Marvelous Designer, and Clo 3D. She teaches students how to use these within their own practices. She emphasizes like the affordances of CGAI as an industrial tool with her own digital tool that she's made called Digital.3D, which, to describe it just like very briefly, is like a kind of cut and unwrap tool. I mean, I've not used it, so this explanation is sort of fairly theoretical. But it essentially allows you to take kind of like 3D topology by drawing on 3D models, and then you're able to unwrap that as like a 2D vector pattern, which she explained to me is like a very, very difficult thing to do. News to me. She introduces to her student this idea, which I've been really taken with, which I've like come to call SPJ theory, which is that she feels the need to sort of convince her students that not all digital fashion is just like silver puffer jackets, that these are sort of, it's like a very easy thing to render. It's kind of a product of sort of something that looks really flashy, that's something that's very easy to achieve, and they're just like totally kind of synthetic and contextless, and she understands this as like a very off-putting. And I think this is a kind of an important quote. I think she says, so she says, when I look at some digital fashion, it's being presented to me in a vacuum. A lot of the time there isn't a body in it, so it's void of any sense of humanity or how someone would wear it. This has created a digital fashion aesthetic that's put lots of people off. And we've had to do quite a lot of damage control to turn people around to understand that digital is just a tool. Your work could be about real, physical craft and working with organic materials, and you could still have a digital element to the way that you work. It's just interesting to kind of hear the perspective of someone who is like thinking in terms of pedagogy and thinking in terms of teaching, and is coming up against this thing. She's also having to sort of convince her students that CGI can be a technology for embodiment. It's a kind of fundamental part of like her beliefs around these things and her own work. And the way that she sort of, kind of the focus that she has is that it's very much focused on industry and making physical processes less wasteful and more creative with digital tools. She thinks there's so much to the point that like, she talks about digital world building as sort of the byproduct of the tools that she's using. And she says this kind of provocative thing, which is that she sees the fact that it enables you to create these really fascinating CGI worlds almost as a byproduct. So, after talking to her, one of the things I kept thinking was like, it's being suggested that sort of world building might be the new dominant form of cultural production at the moment. But is world building actually just industrial runoff? Is it just like a symptom of the tools that are being used? Another really interesting thing that she said to me, I kind of only want to talk about this like quite briefly, but I think it's really cool and important, is that I was kind of asking her about kind of fashion NFTs. And she sort of said to me like, oh, I never really understood this idea of the fashion NFT as being something that you could like pull between different game worlds or different metaverses. She was like, when I'm gaming or like when I'm being represented inside a video game, she wants the way that she looks or her skin or her like kind of character creation to reflect her like in-game time. So the kind of tasks and the kind of the amount of stuff she's completed, her achievements within the game, and that the idea of like bringing it through contextless into another gaming environment like never really like appealed to her. I found this to be like a really interesting like distinction, not something that I've heard anyone really talk about, and it made me start thinking about sort of like gamer aesthetics and specifically like kind of in-game like representational aesthetics that are associated with certain kinds of like skill checks or commitment to the game. I'm kind of thinking of like, if you beat a certain number of races in Mario Kart, you get a gold Mario, or like, and there's a really old one which is like, is it RuneScape? And like the most expensive digital asset in RuneScape was just like a really dumb like party hat. But what's kind of interesting to me about it is that they have this tendency towards like the absurd or the abject. It's like, oh, it's actually moving away from the body. So a question I had kind of asking her about this approach to gaming was like, is it the dream for lots of gamers just to become an uploaded consciousness with no body? Is that what like a lot of gamers actually want? I'm sure it's possibly true. That just feels like a reality that I personally am unable to get my head around. Someone who kind of has the opposite position would be Elizabeth Gabrielle Lee, who's talking tomorrow. Recently wrote this really, really amazing piece called Paradance for Squad.zip. I really recommend you all read it. It's one of the most kind of enlightening pieces of writing I've read like in my experience about this stuff. Yeah, and so it's basically a potted history of para dance culture, its significance as a vector for youth rebellion in Japan, and has this emphasis on the body of the gamer and this idea of embodying the avatar. So in a way, she's kind of positioning Para Paradise, which is a game she discusses within the piece, as like the polar opposite of Roblox. It's a kind of a dance rhythm game. Your body's involved. She talks about it in terms of, this convergence of human and machine logic. So it's not a passive gaming practice, but she describes it in terms of like haptic ritual, the dance of becoming the machine. Really beautiful quote, which is, in the game, the player does not transcend their physical body, but rather engages fully with their fleshiness, what the dancing machine demands, and not moves to escape, but to step into the now here. To perform these movements meant they didn't have to mimic any digital character, they were already avatar. This feels like the answer to the sort of kind of dystopian Roblox divide, and this, we're now starting to feel, this starts to feel like a kind of very, very straightforward way in which CGI and sort of the AI within games can be the sort of technology for embodiment. So these are some of the questions that I had. I find it like to be a really convincing theory about how we might use gaming technology to get back to the body. Can it help us to become avatars, both in kind of virtual space and in IRL space? Will this help us navigate the high-dimensional space of the neural media environment? I'm thinking of the kind of Alex Keatshow girls as mechs idea, as well as LARP increasingly becoming like the kind of default existential mode, maybe the only mode left after the collapse of subculture and the kind of general flattening out of culture into content. I'm really taken by this idea of para dances as like a kind of example of like going back to music as a musical medium for embodiment and image construction and world building. I also love this idea that's in the piece, which is about this idea of a kind of garishness and volatility as being a driver of kind of liberation and emancipation from these conservative and moralistic thresholds in a society flanked by minimalism and contemplation. I'm quoting the piece there. This is sort of a slight side note, but it kind of veered in my head. It veered into this idea of maybe like a potential sort of sloptimist argument, thinking along the same lines of that logic, which is like, can we maybe see CG and AI slop as potentially pushing thresholds for a kind of collectivization, sort of away from individualized notions of the subject and towards a more embodied understanding of the collective through like kind of collective action. This idea that all mess is everyone's mess, but like all art is everyone's art. I wonder whether there's like there's a sort of resonance there. I think the most vital thing in the piece is that it's sort of like, she positions it as like a kind of a necessary simulation or like a survival mechanism through fleshiness and through carnality. She says it offers a form of freedom found in submission to a system, a paradoxical bondage through repetition, where high art often privileges abstraction and intellectual excess. Para rewards shamelessness with instant gratification. If it's not dance, as defined by the Academy, perhaps it's something more vital, a movement for carnal pleasure. I love this idea about this engagement of the body and the kind of game logic and these sort of like virtual and real environments becoming a way of interfacing with a reality that's frayed and messy, and that it might be the sort of survival mechanism that we need to sort of parse sort of this kind of like algorithmic hell of the now. I feel like we're really getting somewhere with this piece, and it really reminds me of the work of Team Rolfers. I don't know how many of you guys are familiar with Team Rolfers, but they're like kind of this incredible performance art, performance sort of. It's very hard to describe what they do actually, because it's so full on. I've kind of in my notes here I've written technosomatic Gesamtkunstwerk, which is something that Sam said in a conversation that I had with him. From an intro to something I wrote about them that never got published, I describe kind of what their practice is. Together they kit bash 3D animation, motion capture, VR puppetry, and music that skews towards the loud and abrasive into technosomatic Gesamtkunstwerks. Total artworks that anchor the virtual and the visceral. Their live shows are an overwhelming spectacle that blur the lines between experimental theatre and the bleeding edge of tech performance art, all shot through a speculative satire that threads through a deft navigation of the esoteric overlap of art, technology, cultural theory, and comedy. I guess to make it a bit easier to understand, they're sort of like on-stage and motion capture suits, and lots of the sort of CGI assets that are being projected on the screens behind them are tied to the movements of their bodies as they're performing. So it's this real sort of like visceral, immersive, like performance piece that I guess brings the idea of like the kind of the game logic of paradise or the paradance thing onto sort of a more like kind of hyperactive or kind of immersive stage setting. I spoke to Jacob Backler. I don't know if you know the Twitter guy Horse eBooks kind of wrote that tweet, famous tweet. Everything happens so much. That was Jacob. Described Team Rolfers in a much shorter way than I did. Just said that they show the world as it could be if we allowed ourselves to make more and more interesting mistakes. If we actually sought to reclaim control over the cocoon of systems that we've slowly allowed to wrap around us. So for me, Team Rolfers, within their work, the idea of embodiment, physicality and viscerality is explored as proceeding from CGI avatars, kit-bash motion capture technology, and this kind of headfuck electronic music. And it's all explored in real time. The lights are on the screen, the bodies are on the stage. There's a sort of immanence to the way that their performance stuff works. I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to put that up on the stage, but I'm not going to read any of it. What Sam Rolfers is saying in this quote very briefly is that sort of at the center of their performance practice is this kind of desire to try to bleed through the physical into their kind of performance practice, to have everything tied to the motion of the body, and in so doing, to kind of critique the kind of delivery systems, the technology, the UI that kind of surrounds us in our world at the moment. He says that the contrast between the two, the sort of the kind of the virtual and the physical, is a mirror to let you understand each side of that space. I think it kind of gets back to this idea of the janky metaverse stuff that you guys have have come up with, because the performance is like, it's undeniably janky. It sort of like amplifies human perfection. You can see the awkwardness of how people stand, where their motion sensors are interfering with each other, kind of their ability to kind of comprehend the body is actually enhanced. You're seeing movements on the screen that you're missing on the stage. It might allow the audience to even understand the performance like better in a more immediate way. In this piece that never got published, I'm really sad about it, I spoke to a character that is in one of their stage shows, 3-2-1 Rule, which I describe as real-time club theatre. I spoke to this character, Eris Wonderful, who within the piece is a kind of bounty hunter who specializes in retrieving the hard-to-reach memories of people who have uploaded their consciousnesses into like what is essentially like a near-future version of a kind of dystopian cloud. And in each of their performances, when they do it around the world, they get different people to perform as Eris Wonderful. So I kind of interviewed a series of the people that perform as Eris, asking questions that are, I guess, similar to some of the questions I'm asking today. Some of them are pretty funny. I like it when Jacob says that unless you're jacked into a high latency network, you haven't lived, baby. And he talks about data in a really funny way. He says that data is what makes the world go round. If there's any difference between me and the data, I must not have noticed. So for Jacob, CGAI is certainly a technology for embodiment. Lil Mariko is one of the people who sometimes performs as Eris Wonderful, had a much shorter thing to say, which is, are there any physical experiences that you can compete with all the consuming spectacle of the virtual? She says no. In the virtual space, people are less difficult to look at. Where does your body end and your code begin? She says, I couldn't tell you. She's made so many alterations to the physical body, so why would she stop? Fair enough. Another of the performers is Girlfriend of the Year, GFOTY. I kind of like to answer the most. She says that roller coasters are pretty sick. I agree that maybe going on a roller coaster could compete with the all-consuming spectacle of the virtual. And then when I asked her, like, where does your body end and your code begin? She says, my body ends at my vagina and my code begins within my heart. Which is obviously really funny, but it's also kind of brilliant. It gets this idea directly that I'm trying to chase, I think, which is, yes, this idea of embodiment, this idea of like collapsing this dynamic and working out how, technology might enable me to like kind of feel this in a kind of more immediate way. Motion capture, which is like a big fundamental part of Team Rolfers, is also a core component of what A New Plane does. Their output as a creative technology studio kind of involves or includes making digital avatars of actors, models, and musicians, but also sort of like doing body mapping and like motion capture for like editorial as well. Rasheen McVeigh, who I work with, I mentioned earlier, in a conversation we had recently, she said that like when we're creating anyone's digital avatar, the process of motion capture is always the moment when you truly feel that someone's digital likeness. So we're kind of finally getting to this moment where maybe it's in the process of motion capture that we might find like kind of some of the key example for using like CGI as like a kind of technology for embodiment. This conversation was with Katerina Korbjin, so this is also being released on a new plain editorial really soon. We were speaking to her. You may not know who she is. She's a creative director. She's the digital editor for System magazine. She was recently appointed the CBO of Lady Gaga's House Labs, which is a perfume brand. She's also the founder of Paradigm Trilogy, which is kind of the reason that we wanted to speak to her. We were speaking to her about motion capture, and we're talking about it in the frame of it being the synthesis of physical gesture and technological sensor. And we recently posted a video of the model Leon Dam walking a runway in a motion capture suit, and the kind of raw motion capture footage like being shown at the same time. And this is something that really took Katerina, it really resonated with her. She said that what I see is an individual trying to look at itself from the outside. It's almost like looking at ourselves as a specimen, studying ourselves in the extension of our borders, the borders of self. So she positions motion capture as this technology that might actually expand the way that we can understand ourselves, much in the same way that Team Rothfuss does. There's an extent to which it might get to sort of the immediacy of movement, the immediacy of physical expression as well. Paradigm Trilogy, just to explain it really briefly, was like a kind of a series of 3 fashion publications. Each of them were sort of produced in a different way, and each of them were tied to both a city and a physical object. The first one was like a box of matches. I can't remember what the second one was. Oh, the second one was like a kind of a sculpture. And the third one was both a film and a perfume they released. The perfume was called Sweat, and it was created by this process called enfilage, which is like when you extract the scent from something. And we were talking about how motion capture might be understood as kind of analogous to enfilage, and maybe there's this kind of connection between the two processes, that you're kind of capturing a certain likeness from a person that can then persist on, and then your experience of this sort of essence or likeness puts you in proximity to that person even when they're not like physically there. I think so. Katerina found this interesting. She said that by extracting someone's scent, you're essentially 4D scanning. Scent is a memory, of course, but it's also a transmitter of information and things we don't know and don't remember. I know when I smell my boyfriend's armpit that I'm definitely not dreaming. In that way, enfilage is a reminder, both a memento mori and a reminder of the now. This is actually different. So the difference between this and motion capture, and she points this out, is that while you need the analog anchor for enfilage, motion capture is actually a tool that doesn't need the original anymore. And she starts talking about ABBA Voyage. She asks, why do we need ABBA if we can have something that looks like it and sounds like it? ABBA Voyage is then ABBA. It's Walter Benjamin. Can the spirit of the artwork be recreated? The question is, how much is spirit part of our experience of something? And it kind of got me thinking, like, can aura be preserved with motion capture? I kind of want to bring in sort of Alex Keacho a little bit in conversation with Walter Benjamin here. She wrote a really good feature called Aura Points, which is adapted from a lecture she gave, and wrote, again, this was also in Squad.zip. In that piece, she kind of describes aura as the ineffable quality that turns someone from an ordinary person into a persona. She goes on to say, making the jump to the neural age requires aura maxing for girls, both material and synthetic. The dream is to exist and thrive as a self-possessed and untouchable entity that does not waste energy on shaping oneself to limited human concerns. Instead, the girl makes an entrance with her infinite aura and waits for the world to shape itself around her. So this got me thinking, like, if motion capture is the generation of a virtual likeness of a body, can it also be the world shaping itself around an aura? And is the kind of avatar creation or kind of avatar embodiment, to go back to Elizabeth's piece, is that the kind of body that's produced in the age of neural media? It's possible. there is, like, taking that further, is like, can the spirit be simulated? Like, what is the spirit? Is there an absence of spirit? Katerina makes a very good point that it's like definitely not Abba's spirit, but maybe it's the spirit of the person that created the simulation. She kind of draws on the work of Sherry Turkle, who argues that our digital expression is as spiritual as our real expression. It's not the computer in us, it's just us. So it was just us all along. It's unclear to me about whether the spirit is simulated. I've not been to Abba Voyage, so I don't know about how much of an embodied experience it would have been for me. Maybe someone here has, and it was. But something that Katerina really believes in is that it is possible to imbue things with spirit. There's a kind of animism at play in her work. And the kind of primary medium that she's kind of settled on for this is film, which is why she decided to make the third issue of Paradigm Trilogy a film. She calls it the most embodied medium and talks about it in terms of accessibility. This also extends to the use of CGI for a new plane, and when we were talking to her about it, she aligned it with this idea of experimentation with drugs, and was really resonant for me. She said, I think there's an intrigue in CGI aesthetics in the same way that there was an interest in psychedelics in the 70s as a way of dissolving and reassembling reality. With CGI, we're given a tool that can stretch our visual world in something that's maybe more accurate to how it feels rather than to how it looks to us. I think maybe this is the idea that I'm really trying to get at, or trying to understand the hardest, which is that kind of uses of CGI and AI that get closer to how it feels to exist as a body, in the same way that certain kinds of drugs do, that enhance your ability to understand that or to perceive it. She kind of closed this conversation with a quote that I kind of resonated with me, it stuck with me, where she asserts that CGI and AI are useful tools to get close to an understanding of the physical and a digital world. In fashion, they're at their best when they play with the codes of our genre, not when fashion is trying to abide by their codes. That's when we can comment on our sense of self through technology. Kind of gets back to the beginning, which is this idea that, I had hoped that kind of this move towards fashion from AV art might get closer to the body, and she kind of suggesting that it is possible. And I think in her work it is, and in the work of A New Plane I think it is, and in lots of the people who have put work on the squad.zip kind of editorial platform, I think that's at play too. Gosh, sorry, that was so long. This is the end. The end is I wanted to show all the questions again. I don't know how many of them have been answered, like in the scope of this. I think there's some ideas there. There's some ideas that kind of relate to these, but it's still very much a kind of work in process for me. As like an editor and as someone who's like commissioning work, I think I am still just going to carry on asking these questions. I'm going to ask them of you. I'm going to ask them of the writers that I'm kind of like hoping to like elucidate these ideas for me. And I guess now that maybe there's like a little bit of time for questions, I actually kind of want to flip it back, and maybe I'd be really interested to hear if any of you have any answers to the questions that are on the screen at the moment. But that's talk. Thank you.
So I guess, does anyone have any answers to the questions? Yeah.
I could probably answer one.
Oh, hang on.
Digital fashion.
A sec.
Oh, sorry. Is anybody there? Oh, sorry. I teach digital fashion upstairs, so it's interesting. That's a question, but for me, it's the relearning of heritage in a way that we reuse and see fashion. But when you're actually cutting and physically involved with fashion, digitally is a completely different game. And you understand that there's a tactility with it and not just like a visual representation. And really getting involved in what it means to have fluidity, gravity, persona and environmental in a digital space, and what is in a physical space compared to fashion. But yeah, that's really interesting. There was this kind of like, between these two conversations that I've kind of had over the last few months, there was this tension between, Hilary Taymor of Clean Estrada, who in part of the conversation with her,
had this like real like visceral like hateful rant against the use of Clo 3D, and was like, I don't let anyone who designs for me use it. It's all designed for one type of body. It's like it's a tool that I think is abhorrent. It's making fashion like rubbish at the moment, which is kind of an interesting thing. It was an interesting perspective to hear, and the way that she had this like dystopian vision of like no one being able to like cut and sew anymore. They're just people at banks of computers using this tool. I then spoke to Kathy Migi about this, and I think her take on that was that, well, it's sort of a misunderstanding of what you can do with that technology, but also that in order to use that technology well, you have to have a really amazing understanding of heritage and like kind of traditional techniques. And actually, within industry, like where she sees her, maybe you have this too, where she sees her students getting jobs now in industry, they are desperate for people who can use these technologies in like new and like innovative ways that draw on old techniques and methods.
We went through the same thing with Photoshop.
Yeah, of course.
So the same realities.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. And I remember that you mentioned about the Paradigm Trilogy, the magazine. I remember I saw their first issue back in like 2021, and it was like there's one question really intriguing me that is, I remember they mentioned it in their first issue. They say Ferrari opened their first fashion line, and will Toyota be the new Balenciaga? And it was like really interesting question. And yeah, so thank you for bringing back the memories that for the magazine, and definitely gonna check their the third issue, or
yeah. It's the film's really amazing if you haven't seen it. It's like really beautifully written and directed film, but there are moments like in the middle of the film that it pauses and there's sort of like a text prompt, and it asks you questions and you answer it. It's sort of like this kind of like reverse chatbot thing. I kind of felt like I was being shown the training data and then being asked to kind of parse it for them.
yeah.
But the third film, I think it reflects on how much has changed as well since the first of the Paradigm Trilogy, and like this like continued like the way that brands have become these like content platforms or whatever it is. Like, I think it's been called like the marvelization of brands. That just seems to have accelerated to the point where it was spoken about earlier, where it's really hard to engage with what they even are now and how they function.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, to relate it back to kind of Squad.zip, which is a kind of a new marketplace. It's a marketplace that we're trying to build from the ground up. It's really hard to know how to engage with brands in a way that kind of feels relevant to the writing that we're putting out on the editorial platform, but also that relevant to the kind of marketplace that they're trying to build. It's become this kind of like, yeah, it's hard to kind of to grapple with like where the foothold is there. Yeah.
So they're moving to the new platform. I mean the magazine, like.
Oh, so no, sorry, I was talking about Squad.zip.
Okay.
So there is a marketplace that's separate, which is called Squad, and then there's an editorial platform, which is sort of the kind of like front-facing, like editorial like identity, and that's what me and Telly edit and run together.
Yeah. Thank you. And then, and also like it's really worth thinking, what is fashion like? Is it a platform, and how like people from different domain and they interact with fashion industry? And yeah. Thank you.
So I guess my answer to the first question would be it just already is. You know, like I guess my slight suspicion or question around the framing, I think, of some of this stuff is the idea of getting back to a body or getting back to embodiment. You know, like if you're trans, for example, the things you do to your body, you know, you have this like keen awareness, like in the sense of Preciado, that like the body is already something that is mediated, you know, it's artificially produced all the way from the ground up. And I find this kind of sense of like, oh, there's this embodiment thing that like is at odds with digital experience in some way that you're trying to get back to. I find this like sus personally,
Yeah.
you know, and I guess I'm kind of like, I feel like the I read the article before the dance mat one, and I think you're right. Like it's like a good moment where you can think about the relationship between the body, inputs, outputs, screens, and so in the way you kind of already answer the question there. But I guess, you know, if you have like a transcendent kind of disembodiment on one side, and then like the nostalgic body on the other side, you know, that I kind of think like all of this stuff wants you to then be able to perceive that you need to get out of that dichotomy, you know, to kind of get to like how bodies just function. It's just, I don't know. This is my answer to your question.
No, I totally agree. And I guess, yeah, like a kind of subplot to this talk is, yeah, like my own personal kind of journey of like trying to get out of the dichotomy. I've clearly been unable to do so. And it's a really good point. It kind of goes back to the robot question. Like, I am well aware that some of people's most fundamental sort of like, kind of like, like gender and sexual expressions happen within gaming platforms. I mean, also everyone's like formative sexual experiences are mediated by like watching porn on the internet probably as well. So I'm well aware of that. And yes, I guess maybe it should be specified that it comes from a kind of more, like a more personal frame, which is getting back to this idea of like what it was like to be like experiencing like music for me, which was, you know, it was all to do with like bodies being next to me. It was all to do with sort of like proximity and heat and speed and sweat. And I guess one of the things I'm trying to think through, which is why I'm asking all of you and asking you specifically, I guess in this instance, is like what the kind of like how that stuff translates, or like what that is in a more kind of mediated space, and what the alternative is the wrong word, but like how do those things sort of like map over, or how do they like transform into a different context?
Sounds like one of the key aspects that you're talking about is the idea of a shared or collective experience of some kind, or like that feeling, and what that kind of the desubjectivizing aspect of that kind of experience, and then how that functions, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think it is. I again, grappling with this idea of like, I think it was, I can't remember who said this, but it's like, it's hard to get your head around why you wouldn't want to be a subject. But I think loads of us don't. Loads of us don't want to be a subject, but it's hard to think about why that is. And I guess that's, yeah, maybe why I'm asking these questions. I'm maybe asking whether one of you has an answer for it.
I work a lot with CG and like also motion capture. I make kind of similar stuff to Team Wolfson, Zora Jones and St. John Hawk and people like that.
Sick.
And I was basically wondering, I was thinking about like motion capture as well, and you know how it's kind of become a lot more democratized. Like before, it was kind of, you know, very difficult to do this kind of stuff. In the same way, AI was quite complex with like TensorFlow, and you know, a lot of this kind of technologies can getting increasingly democratized. And I was also thinking about like in sort of the rise of like V streamers and like sort of these sort of game streamers that are using this same kind of technology, and are sort of increasingly blurring the lines between you know, it's like the sort of virtual video game world is increasingly seeping into our reality. And then I mean, I'm also from more in the music world. I'm not that clued up on like fashion kind of stuff, but from what I do know is that I've seen a lot of, you know, this sort of like in the same way these like video game aesthetics like seeping into like the fashion world to a certain degree as well, like this sort of like medieval aesthetic I've seen quite a lot recently. So I was just wondering, you know, like another question I had was back to you was, you know, could digital fashion work from like kind of a grassroots level in the same way as like the music industry? So in the ways that we have like independent venues and independent club nights and stuff, you know, I was thinking maybe like upcycling could be like an example of that.
Yeah. Yes, for sure. And I think if you look at what the squad marketplace is now, partially just by necessity, it feels like that's very much what it is. It's like a platform for kind of grassroots digital fashion. It's kind of creators who are all making very, very different kinds of work. But yeah, it's all, those are the people that we're platforming at the moment. And my great ambition for it would be that would be what that kind of space is for. That it's like a way in which you're able to rethink the way that the stuff that you're making you can make money from it. It'd be really sick if someone who just like, does bits of motion capture for your DJ friends, or you're able to like, yeah, if you're able to like help a kind of grassroots party in that kind of way, we'll be able to like put this stuff up on score.zip and pay rent from it. That's sort of the space I think, yeah, I see it sort of like emerging into, and I hope it would be specifically, one of its affordances would specifically be to do with like making grassroots things possible in an easier way.
Any responses? Or maybe I would just say, I mean, like, I think to reiterate what someone else was mentioning, I think like for me that the kind of dichotomy, or this notion that even there could be a form of embodiment outside of technological sort of intervention just is itself a kind of, yeah, like a fallacy or kind of ideology, or which is kind of, I guess in a way it's the flip side of that very Elon Muskian sort of idea that we could just kind of at some point just upload our brains to the cloud, and then we wouldn't have to then deal with the messiness of this kind of like bodies that we have to kind of like lump around or like drag around. And I think, you know, so I think that sort of notion of sort of like embodiment, or the body being this kind of pure thing, that somehow then gets polluted or sort of tarnished through technological kind of invention is just, yeah, that itself is a kind of ideology. I remember like years ago, like hearing William Gibson just mention something about that, this kind of process, and just saying like anyone who's like over 30 and has got like their teeth, like is the fact that you have teeth at 30 or whatever is a technological, because of technological interventions. It's like, yeah, like kind of our health and things like that completely. Yeah. So I think there's that aspect. And I guess, you know, also I think like thinking about fashion or digital fashion as this kind of separate thing. I just like, what form of fashion is not digital now? Like. Yeah.
So to go to your first point, I actually, if it's come across that way, that it's kind of not what I'm supposed to be saying, is that...
Oh, no, it's not to you.
Yeah,
not like, I think more just the questions that you were asking.
Yes, of course. And I don't think that there's like a purity in the body, of course. I think, yeah, in the examples of like Team Rolfers and some of the stuff that Katharina was saying, actually what I kind of am most interested in is like using CGI as a technology to like, to get back to the messiness of the body. It's not that there's a kind of dichotomy there, it's like a more visceral experience of that. So it's like, yeah, an enhancement in a way. So how you kind of meld those things together. What fashion isn't digital? Well, I guess like my answer to that is that so a friend of mine writes for how to spend it, and our worlds, the way that we write about kind of and think about fashion are so different. That's a huge like, and you know, of course, like yes, all fashion imagery is digital. The way that how to spend it is like kind of talking to his audience is a digital like concept. I guess what maybe the distinction is that it's going back to the grassroots thing, which is like kind of art creators and designers who would like consider themselves digital artists or digital like fashion creators, and yeah, I don't know. There's something that's not accounted for. I think I just was really struck by, and remain struck by, like how skeptical and cynical people who are sort of like more interested in like legacy fashion world are of like even a notion of digital fashion, and like actually don't like seeing CGI visuals in editorial and adverts, and the idea of motion capture just seems like kind of cringe. And I'm sort of with them in a way. Like I can become a bit of a Luddite in that sense. Like I kind of think the fashion images that I have liked historically haven't been ones that are sort of like super technologically mediated. I really like magazines, I really like print, I really like film stock. That's obviously a technology in itself, but to talk about it in terms of like a kind of like a digital focus, I am interested in like understanding a bit more about the sort of like emotional resonance or the affect of what that divide is. Like what, is it just people are scared of it? Is it that people are scared of technology coming in? Is it because people don't want to like reckon with what the kind of industrial side of fashion is? There's like some kind of tensions there that like I, for having not like worked with this very long, don't yet understand. I'm trying to kind of pass them through myself.
Yeah. Yeah, because I wonder whether some of it is, I mean, I guess like the scale that fashion now operates on, like to personally have a dislike for a certain form of representation of image production or whatever. Yeah, obviously individually fine, whatever, you know, but I guess like there's a certain sort of forces at play which do strongly determine what kinds of content is being produced, and that may not necessarily, and like for aesthetic pleasure or whatever, that may be quite low on the list of priorities. I mean, I think like, as I was trying to like partly sort of like talk about in the intro, was like, I think that obviously there's things that are going on in regards to kind of like the kind of platform logics and things like that that do incentivize certain kinds of like processes and outputs, right? So I wonder, again, I think like with the sort of this notion of sort of like digital fashion, I mean, this is like more broadly, I just always find it a very, it's like almost like a kind of term coming out of like the late 90s or something. Just like, why are we even referring to this? Like, why do we have to put digital in this
That's
thing?
sort of what I'm getting
Do you know what I mean?
at,
It kind of feels like whose life is not affected like quite fundamentally by sort of digital processes that have been going on for decades and decades, and like even within very sort of embodied, physically embodied kind of encounters, like our bodies in those encounters are fundamentally shaped by these kind of technologies, again, like from the ground up. So yeah, I always find that a very, like this notion of digital fashion always feels like so clumsy as a kind of term, as a general sort of term for actually what's going on.
Yeah, is there a better term?
Yeah, because I just think it's also sort of like a denial of actually like, it kind of seems to sort of deny actually sort of what's going on in fashion when you're also just also talking about the production of a garment or something.
Exactly.
You know,
Yeah.
like again, like how less digital is that than kind of skin or something? You know,
Yeah.
like I really I'm not convinced one is digital or one's more digital and one's not.
Yeah, and well, in the case of someone like Cathy, they're always the same thing, and that's what digitality is. I guess that's what like kind of the idea of a digital twin is. But so should we just be calling it fashion, or is there another way to describe it in a way that is like?
Yeah, or maybe, I mean, I guess like maybe the thing that certain people are referring to in opposition to digital fashion is no longer fashion. Like it's just, it's like, I mean, I guess, you know, like it's clothes or something.
Yeah.
You know, like I think there is a difference between like fashion and clothes.
Yeah,
I mean, even like historically, you know, like the notion of like fashion is this kind of, it's a mark of kind of capitalism, and it kind of operates within that logic. And that is different to clothes. Like the making of clothes is like a thing, right? Obviously, but so it may be something like what they are referring to is this kind of return to
clothes.
like clothes and the making and selling of clothes, where like fashion is in itself is kind of embedded in like contemporary contemporary culture, and kind of reflecting that and trying to kind of push it in certain directions, I guess. You know, historically, you know, that has been its always been part of its kind of DNA, I guess. But okay, I think we will leave it there. So thanks very much, Henry. Brilliant
Thank
talk.
you.